All right, this is going to be a homework walkthrough for chapter 6-3. We'll start with question 1. Molander Corporation is a distributor of a sun umbrella used at resort hotels. Data concerning the next month's budget appear below. And they give us my selling price per unit, variable per unit, total fixed, and the number of units sold in the month. And they want to know what is the company's margin of safety. That's the first one. And then they want to know what the company's margin of safety as a percentage of sales. So the first thing I did was I copied down all of this information from right here. So we've got to make some calculations to figure out margin of safety. So first of all, what are my total sales? So that's going to equal my selling price per unit times my unit sales for the month. And then I need my variable total. So again, that's going to be the variable per unit times the unit sales. And then my contribution margin equals sales minus variable expenses. Okay. Okay, so the definition of margin of safety is it's the excess in total sales that you have over and above your break even in sales dollars. So that's where I'm headed right now. So in order to get my break even point in sales dollars, I need to know my contribution margin ratio. And again, to do a ratio, you do the part or the contribution margin divided by the whole, which is sales, because we want to know how much is contribution margin of sales. So that gives me a 25% ratio. And then we will take the fixed expenses divided by the contribution margin ratio to get break even in sales dollars. Okay, so now my margin of safety then is equal to, my total sales minus my break even point in sales dollars. And then they want to know the margin of safety percent. So again, that's a ratio. So we're going to take the margin of safety, which is the part, divided by total sales. We want to know what is the margin of safety of sales. And they want it again. So at this point, you've got to be really comfortable with making sure that you read all of these words in red. So my percentage answer is to 2 decimal places. And they didn't tell me about the dollars, but mine came out even, so I guess it didn't matter. Okay, question 2. Angerberg Company installs lawn sod in home yards. The company's most recent monthly contribution format income statement follows. So sales, variable expenses, on and on to contribution margin. And then it tells me my ratios right here. So I copied all of that data right here. First, they want to know what is the company's degree of operating leverage. So you get degree of operating leverage by dividing contribution margin by net operating income. So equals, here's my contribution margin, right? They gave me divided by net operating income. Okay, so now the degree of operating leverage means that's how fast net operating income grows compared to how much sales grow. So in my instance, my net operating income is going to grow 4.62 times faster than how much ever my sales grow, which is going to come in handy in required two, using the degree of operating leverage. Remember, we just figured out, estimate the impact on net operating income of an 8% increase in unit sales. So I'm going to put 8% right there just so that I can reference that number. Obviously, if sales are going to increase, then net operating income is going to increase. And I know that just by logic, right? Because it doesn't say anything about any other expenses increasing. It's strictly sales increase, so my net operating income will also increase. If my sales decrease, then my net operating income will also decrease, unless they give me other data. So now, by using this degree of operating leverage, I can figure out how much net operating income is projected to increase by just taking that 8% increase in sales and multiplying it by the degree of operating leverage that we got in required one. So my net operating income then is projected to increase 36.92%, which is 4.62 times faster than sales increase of 8%. Okay, required 3. Construct a new contribution format income statement for the company, assuming an 8% increase in unit sales. So there's a couple ways I can, let's see. Yeah, I'm just going to do, this is going to equal, sorry for my scrolling, my sales times parentheses 1 plus the 8% increase. Okay, right? Because I want to add all of total sales plus 8%. So that's why it's total sales times 1 plus the percentage increase. Close my parentheses. Okay. And as you're filling in this new contribution format income statement for required 3, right here they want to know, okay, what percent is sales of sales? Well, it's 100%. Sales is always 100%. Now, let's see. They told me, they gave me these. So this one is 40%, right? It was given. Variable expense ratio is 40%. Contribution margin ratio is 60%. Okay. So now that I have my ratios and I have my new increase in sales, to get my variable expenses, they're going to be 40% of sales. So I'm going to equals my variable expense ratio times total sales. And then in the book, that those 2 lines get filled in for you. So then I just need my fixed expenses, which are given right there. And then the book calculates that for you as well. So that's how you fill in that contribution margin income statement. And just remember, when they're talking about the ratios of sales versus variable versus contribution margin, sales is always 100%, and variable expense and contribution margin together add up to sales. So these 2 ratios together should always equal 100%. Okay, question 3. Menlo Company distributes a single product. The company's sales and expenses for last month are as follows. So basically they gave me a little income statement and then my per units. So the first thing they want to know is, what is the monthly break-even point in unit sales and in dollar sales? Okay, so the first thing I did, right, is I copied this information here. Okay, so if you remember, break-even point in unit sales is going to be the fixed expenses divided by the contribution margin per unit. And the break-even point in dollars is going to be fixed expenses divided by the contribution margin ratio. So let's see. Yep, they gave me that. Okay. So for the break-even point in unit sales, I'm just going to take my fixed expenses divided by my contribution margin per unit. Okay, so that tells me how many units I need to sell to break even. Now for the second part, for dollar sales, I need to find the contribution margin ratio. So again, remember a couple ways you can do this. Contribution margin divided by, or per unit divided by sales per unit, 30%. And remember, because it's a ratio, I could have also taken the total contribution margin and divided it by total sales. And it gives me the same ratio because it's a ratio. So either way, whether you do it per unit or with totals, just make sure both numbers are either a total or both numbers are a per unit, and you'll get the right answer. Okay, so I need to take my fixed expenses and divide that by my contribution margin ratio because I'm getting break-even point in dollar sales. And just remember, break-even point means your net operating income is zero, right? So for net operating income to be zero, then your contribution margin is just enough to cover fixed expenses. So that's why we're dividing fixed expenses to find out break-even points. Okay, so I just gave away required 2. Without resorting to computations, what is the total contribution margin at the break-even point? Well, we need enough to cover our fixed expenses. So break-even point contribution margin would equal fixed expenses, right? Because if this number right here were 73,800, then my net operating income becomes 0, which is the definition of break even. Okay. 3A. How many units would have to be sold each month to attain a target profit of 33,600? Okay, so here's my target profit. Now, instead of getting to 0, they want this net operating income to be this number. So we need our contribution margin to be enough to cover our fixed expenses plus the target profit. So I'm going to take an equals, open parentheses, my fixed expenses plus my target profit, close parentheses, divide by, and they want it in units. So I'm going to divide it by the contribution margin per unit. Okay. So then 3B, verify your answer by preparing a contribution format income statement at the target sales level. So when we prepare this one, the units you're going to use are the ones you just figured out in 3A. So I'm going to take equals that number of units times my selling price of $20 per unit. So I'm going to move that down here, equals 20. And I also need to put in my variable, which was 14. Okay, and that gave me to my 6, so I did it right. So then again, equals the units from 3A times my variable per unit. And then my fixed expenses didn't change, 73,800. And if you did this right, then this number right here should be the same as the target profit that they were asking for in 3A. Okay, so that was 3B. Refer to the original data. So forget everything we just did here. We're going back to the original data, right here. Compute the company's margin of safety in both dollar and percentage terms. Round your percentage answer to 2 decimal places. Okay, so my margin of safety in dollars is simply equals my original sales that they gave me, right? And minus the break-even point in dollar sales. That was the second part of required one. Because that's your margin of safety, is how much above your break-even point in dollars is your total sales. Okay. And then again, to get this ratio, we need to know what percent of sales or what percent of sales is margin of safety. So I'm going to take equals margin of safety divided by, and remember, we're not dealing with what we did for 3B. We're dealing with the original sales that they gave us. And remember to round it to 2 decimal places. Okay. And we're not done yet. Okay, what is the company's contribution margin ratio if the company can sell more units, thereby increasing sales by 94,000 per month, and there is no change in fixed expenses? By how much would you expect monthly net operating income to increase? So let's see. First, I need the contribution margin ratio. So if you, from my original data, this was my sales, and from my original data, this is my contribution margin. So to get the ratio, I go contribution margin divided by sales. So that gives me my ratio. And then how much am I increasing sales? By $94,000. And so to get the net operating income increase, remember, we can now take this contribution margin ratio, and that will tell us how much net operating income will increase. Let me make sure I'm doing this right. Yeah. So equals 30% times the increase in sales. So that's how you can use contribution margin ratio to figure out what your net operating income is going to increase when you know how much sales is going to increase. Okay, question 4. There's a lot to it, but it's really not as scary as it looks. You just have to take it one step at a time and then make sure you understand what they're actually asking you for. So Northwood Company manufactures basketballs. So basketballs are my units, right? Because we're making basketballs. The company has a ball that sells for $25. Okay. So my selling price per unit is $25. At present, the ball is manufactured in a small plant that relies heavily on direct labor workers. Thus, variable expenses are high, totaling $15 per ball. Okay, so there's my variable. of which 60% is direct labor costs. That's nice to know, but I don't think we need to know that for this question. But if I do later, I'll bring it up. Okay, so last year, the company sold 31,500 of these balls. So here's my units. So my sales, they told me 787,500. My variable 472,500. Contribution margin. Let's just see if I did any typos. Okay, that agreed. And then my fixed is 218,400 for a net operating income of, okay, it agrees. So my contribution margin per unit is going to be the sales minus the variable. And then just because I know I'm going to need this at some point, I'm going to figure out my contribution margin ratio. And again, remember, I can use my per unit numbers because I'm figuring out a ratio, or I can use my total numbers. So I'm just going to take my contribution margin per unit divided by the selling price per unit, and that gives me 40% contribution margin ratio. Okay, I believe I've got all the data that they gave me copied into this, which, oh, hey, look, contribution margin ratio. I figured that out right there, right? By taking, well, I'm going to show you how, again, if I take my total contribution margin and divide it by my total sales, I still get that same 40%, right? Because it's a ratio, so I can use the per unit numbers or I can use the total numbers. Just be careful not to grab the wrong number. Okay, so if I want it in unit sales to break even, I take my fixed and divide it by the contribution margin per unit. Dollars divided by dollars equals number of balls. And then degree of operating leverage. Remember, that's contribution margin divided by net operating income. So they told me contribution margin divided by net operating income. So that means that my yeah, anyway, degree of operating leverage. Okay. Okay. So now they're going to throw some changes at me. Required due to an increase in labor rates, the company estimates that next year's variable expenses will increase by $3 per ball. So I'm going to take 3 plus my $15 per unit variable. If this change takes place and the selling price per ball remains constant at 25, so my selling price per unit stayed the same, what will be next year's contribution margin ratio at the break-even point in balls? Oh, and sorry, and the break-even, that makes more sense. Okay, so first of all, my contribution margin per unit, minus sales minus variable equals contribution margin per unit. And then my contribution margin ratio is contribution margin per unit divided by sales price per unit. So that's the first answer you wanted. Now they want the units to break even. So what was my original number of balls? 31,500. Right there. Okay. So to get the units to break even, I need, oh, what's my fixed expenses? Right there, fixed expenses. Okay, so I didn't need the balls. I don't know what I was thinking. Okay, so units to break even is going to be fixed expenses divided by the contribution margin per unit. So 31,200. So again, the dollars divided by the dollars gets you to units. The dollars divided by the ratio would have gotten me to sales dollars, but they didn't ask for that. So we're not going to go there. Okay. So they want me to refer to the data in requirement 2. If the expected change in variable expenses takes place, how many balls will have to be sold next year to earn the same net operating income of 96,600 as last year? So that's my target profit, right? 96,600. So, and they want units. So again, this just means that my contribution margin needs to cover not only my fixed expenses, but also my target profit. So I'm going to take open parentheses. I'm going to take my fixed expenses plus my target profit, close parentheses, divided by, and they want it in units. So I divide it by the contribution margin per unit, which gives me 45,000 balls to get to that same target profit. Okay. So required 4. Refer again to the data in requirement 2. The president feels that the company must raise the selling price of its basketballs. If Northwood Company wants to maintain the same contribution ratio as last year, which, if you'll recall from the very beginning, it was 40% in required 1. So that's the target I'm looking for right there, 40%. What selling price per ball must it charge next year to cover the increased labor costs? So 2 things here. Remember, we're referring to the data in requirement 2. So we're using that same increased variable cost, right? Because the labor increased, so my variable increased. Okay. So just to be clear, which variable per unit we're talking about, and then the contribution margin ratio from last year, which was the very beginning. So this one's a little tricky. I'm going to try and talk slow. So to get to the new selling price, we are going to work completely backwards. Just envision it's this algebra problem and we have some of the answers, but we don't have all of the answers, and we have to keep adding and subtracting from either side of the equal sign and dividing until we get the answer. So instead of doing all that, it's going to equal the variable per unit. Okay, I gotta make sure I'm doing this right. This is how tricky it is. Hold on. Okay, that's what I thought. Okay, so it's gonna be, oh, I have it written right there. The variable expense per unit divided by 1 minus the contribution margin ratio. So I'm gonna take my variable expense per unit divided by, open parentheses, 1 minus the contribution margin ratio. And that gives me a selling price of $30. So it's the variable expense per unit divided by 1 minus the contribution margin ratio. Okay. Now, required 5, we're going back to the original data. So I copied the original data from required 1 down here. Okay, so that's where all that came from, was up here. original data that they gave me and that I figured out and that they gave me. Okay. Just so I don't make you dizzy scrolling. Somebody told me how to freeze screen and it wasn't working for me, so it's fine. We're going to do this. So here's my original data. Okay. The company is discussing the construction of a new automated manufacturing plant. The new plant would slash variable expenses per ball by 40%. Okay, that's huge. So to figure out my new variable, it's going to equal my old variable times, open parentheses, 1 minus, what was it, 40%, 0.4, close parentheses. So that's going to get me my new, because if it slashes, so it's 1 minus what it slashes, and what I have left will be the 60%. So that's essentially what 1 minus the 0.4 is getting that to 60%. Okay, what else? But it would cause fixed expenses per year to double. Okay, so where's my fixed expenses? So there's my fixed expenses equals my fixed expenses times 2, because they're going to double. Okay, what else? If the new plant is built, what would the company's new contribution margin ratio and new break-even point involve? Round contribution margin ratio to 2 decimal places and round unit sales to break even to the nearest whole unit. Because you can't make half a ball, right? Okay. So I'm back to my original number of balls, and they did not say that my sales did not change. Okay, the only thing that changed was my variable and my fixed. My sales stayed the same. So equals sales minus variable. And I think that's as far as I need to go. So my new contribution margin ratio would be contribution margin divided by sales. So my new contribution margin is going to equal 64%. And notice I didn't have it rounded here, but those decimals are still there, and mine came out even anyway, but I rounded it 2 decimal places. So now, to get the break-even point in units, I need to have the contribution margin per unit. And the way I can do that is to take that new contribution margin divided by the original number of units from required 1. And that will tell me the contribution margin per unit. Now I have the information I need to figure out the new unit break-even point, or how many balls I need to sell. So again, that's fixed expenses, but remember we're using the new plant information where fixed expenses are doubled, divided by the contribution margin per unit. So I need to sell 27,300 balls to break even. Okay, 6A. Refer to the data in requirement 5. Okay, so this data here. If the new plant is built, how many balls will have to be sold next year to earn the same net operating income of 96,600 at last year? So my target profit is 96,600. And again, to get to the units to the target profit, you're going to take equals the fixed expense from the new plant, right? Oh, I forgot my parentheses. Hold on. Open parentheses plus, so my fixed expenses that are doubled plus my target profit, close parentheses, divided by, and they want it in units. So I'm going to divide it by the contribution margin per unit. So if I want that target profit, I'm going to have to sell 33,338 basketballs. Now, they want me to refer to the data in requirement 5, assume the new plant is built, and that next year the company manufactures and sells 31,500 balls, the same number as last year. So just for fun, I'll put that number right there. Prepare a contribution format income statement and compute the degree of operating leverage. Okay, so I'm just going to transfer down this information I have from the new plant. My sales were the same. And here's my variable that was 40% less. And McGraw-Hill subtracted to get my contribution margin. And then my fixed expenses were doubled, remember? So there's my contribution format income statement using this data. And now they want to know what is the degree of operating leverage. So remember that is equal to the contribution margin divided by the net operating income. So my degree of operating leverage is 7.5. And that's it.